I had spent years saving every extra dollar, skipping vacations, ignoring impulse purchases, and driving my beat-up old sedan into the ground just to finally afford the one thing I had always wanted, a brand new car that was completely mine, paid for with my own hard-earned money. The moment I signed the paperwork and the dealer handed me the keys, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Pure, unfiltered pride in myself. I ran my fingers along the smooth, gleaming hood, inhaled the intoxicating scent of fresh leather seats, and thought, this is mine. Every single part of it is mine. I had barely owned the car for a full day before my younger brother, Jason, decided that my happiness was his for the taking. Jason, who had been coddled and spoiled his entire life, had never worked for anything, never taken responsibility, and never faced a consequence that our parents couldn't sweep under the rug. He was the kind of person who treated other people's things as if they were his by default, because that was the way life had always worked for him. When I pulled into our parents' driveway that evening to show them the car, Jason was already there, leaning against the garage with that lazy, self-satisfied smirk he always wore. He barely even looked up from his phone as I parked. "Nice ride," he said, pushing himself off the wall and strolling over, peering through the driver's side window like he had already decided it belonged to him. "What's the mileage?" "Less than 100, I said, forcing myself to sound neutral, even though I could already feel my patience wearing thin. Jason let out a low whistle, nodding appreciatively. Then, without asking, he reached for the handle and pulled the door open. "Let me take it for a spin." I immediately moved to shut the door before he could climb in, shaking my head firmly. "No way. I just got it. You're not driving it." Jason rolled his eyes like I had just told him he couldn't borrow $1. "Oh, come on, Emily. Don't be such a control freak. It's just a car." "Exactly," I snapped. "It's just a car that I paid for. With my own money. You don't get to take it." But Jason had never been the kind of person to hear no and accept it. He just grinned, gave a little shrug, and backed away, but something about his expression sent a warning chill down my spine, like he already had a backup plan in motion. I should have trusted my instincts.
Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Later that night, I left my car keys on the entryway table for just a few minutes while I went upstairs to grab something from my room. When I came back down, the keys were gone and so was my car. My hands clenched into fists as realization sank in. Jason. I stormed outside, my heart hammering, but by then, he was long gone, tires squealing in the distance. I pulled out my phone and dialed his number, but it went straight to voicemail. Again. And again. I was still fuming when, 2 hours later, my phone finally rang, but it wasn't Jason's number. It was an unknown caller. I answered, already bracing myself. "Miss Anderson?" A deep voice, calm but serious. "This is Officer Reynolds with the County Police Department. I'm calling regarding a vehicle registered under your name." I felt my stomach drop. "What happened?" "There's been an accident." A pause. "The driver is unharmed, but the vehicle sustained significant damage." My grip on the phone tightened. "Who was driving?" The officer hesitated for only a second before answering. "A young man who identified himself as Jason Anderson. I don't even remember driving to the scene of the crash. One moment, I was standing in my parents' entryway, gripping my phone with white knuckles, and the next, I was pulling up behind flashing police lights, my pulse a steady drum of rage. And there he was. My brother. Standing next to what was left of my brand new car, arms crossed, looking completely unfazed. The front bumper was destroyed, the hood crumpled in on itself, and one of the headlights was shattered. My beautiful, perfect car was ruined, and Jason was standing there like it was nothing. I climbed out of my old beater, slamming the door harder than I meant to, my hands shaking as I marched up to him. "What the hell did you do?" Jason finally turned to face me, and then, in the single most infuriating moment of my entire life, he smirked. "That sucks," he said, shrugging like he had just dropped my ice cream cone instead of wrecking my car. "But hey, don't freak out. Mom and Dad will make you forgive me." I felt the words hit me like a slap across the face. Mom and Dad will make me forgive him. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an acknowledgement of what he had done. It was a smug, arrogant declaration that no matter how angry I was, no matter how much damage he had caused, it wouldn't matter, because our parents would smooth it over, just like they always did. I took a slow, measured breath, my fists clenched at my sides, my pulse thundering in my ears. That was the moment something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let him get away with it this time. Not this time. Have you ever had a sibling who thought they could get away with anything? Let me know in the comments, because I was done letting it slide. I woke up the next morning with a pounding headache, my body still tense from the sheer frustration of the night before, my mind replaying every single detail of that awful encounter at the crash site. My brother's smirking face haunting me like a nightmare that refused to end. My car, my beautiful, hard-earned, brand-new car, was gone, destroyed in an instant by someone who had never worked a day in his life, someone who had never faced a single consequence. Someone who genuinely believed that my anger was nothing more than an inconvenience to his day. I knew before I even stepped out of bed that my parents would be calling me, that they would be demanding a conversation, that they would try to smooth this over like they always did. As if Jason's actions were just another minor mistake that we could all forget about if I would only be reasonable, like a good daughter should. Sure enough, the moment I checked my phone, I saw 3 missed calls from Mom, 2 from Dad, and a text message from Jason that was so breathtakingly arrogant, I had to read it twice just to believe my own eyes. Stop being dramatic, Em. It's just a car. Mom and Dad said we'll figure it out, so quit acting like it's the end of the world. There was no apology, no remorse, not even the slightest acknowledgement that he had done something wrong, just pure entitlement dripping from every word, as if the real problem wasn't that he had stolen and crashed my property, but that I had dared to make a big deal out of it. I swallowed my rage, forcing myself to breathe slowly, reminding myself that getting worked up over a text message wouldn't help me now. Jason had always been this way, and I knew exactly where he had learned it. I drove to my parents' house, my knuckles white against the steering wheel of my ancient backup car, my stomach twisting with a mix of anger and exhaustion, already knowing exactly how this conversation was going to go. I walked in without knocking, not bothering with pleasantries, finding my parents sitting stiffly at the kitchen table, their expressions a perfect mixture of forced concern and thinly veiled exasperation, as if I were the problem here, as if my reaction was the thing that needed to be fixed. Jason sat slouched in one of the chairs, scrolling through his phone, looking completely unbothered, like he was waiting for this whole thing to blow over so he could move on with his life while I was left to pick up the pieces of what he had ruined. Mom sighed heavily, setting down her coffee cup like she was already exhausted by my presence, rubbing her temples as if she were the victim in all of this. Emily, honey, we need to talk about the situation, because this anger you're holding onto isn't healthy for anyone. I felt something cold settle in my chest, something quiet but dangerous, a slow-burning fury that I had carried for years, but had never fully allowed myself to acknowledge until now. My anger, I repeated, my voice unnervingly calm, my hands resting on the back of an empty chair, gripping the wood so tightly that my fingers ached. You think my anger is the problem here? Dad let out a long sigh, exchanging a quick glance with Mom, their silent communication making it painfully clear that they were united in this, that their decision had already been made before I had even walked through the door. Sweetheart, he said, his voice dripping with condescension, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum over a broken toy. It's just a car. Jason didn't mean to crash it, and we don't think it's fair to punish him so harshly for something that was clearly an accident. I felt something inside me snap, something that had been held together by sheer force of will for years, something that had been stretched and pulled and torn one too many times. He stole it, I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion, because if I let myself feel anything, I knew I would explode. I told him no. He took my keys anyway. He stole my car, wrecked it, and then smirked in my face because he knew you would cover for him, just like you always do. Jason let out a dramatic sigh, finally looking up from his phone, rolling his eyes like this entire conversation was beneath him. Jesus, you're acting like I murdered someone, he muttered, shaking his head, his arrogance radiating off him in waves. I made a mistake, okay? Chill out. Mom reached out, placing a gentle hand on mine, her eyes pleading, her expression carefully crafted into something that looked like love, but was really just manipulation wrapped in a prettier package. Emily, you're his sister, she said softly, tilting her head like she was speaking to a toddler in need of correction. I know you're upset, but family forgives, sweetheart. That's what we do. We forgive each other. I stared at her, at the sheer audacity of those words, at the way she had so effortlessly placed the responsibility on me to fix what Jason had done, like my feelings were an inconvenience, like my hard work meant nothing, like my sacrifices didn't matter as long as Jason was happy. I realized in that moment that I had spent my entire life being conditioned to accept this treatment, to believe that my needs came second, that my anger was unjustified, that my pain was something I had to swallow quietly for the sake of keeping the family peace. But I wasn't that person anymore. I wasn't going to let them guilt me into submission this time. So I did something I had never done before. I smiled. It was small, just a flicker of amusement, but it was enough to make my mother pause, enough to make Jason glance at me with something almost resembling suspicion. You know what? I said, my voice light, my expression deceptively calm, because I had already made up my mind. You're absolutely right, Mom. Family forgives. And I don't want to hold on to this anger anymore. I watched as relief flooded their faces, as Jason's smirk returned, as they all leaned back in their chairs, convinced that they had won, that they had successfully broken me down into the version of myself that they preferred. But they had no idea what I was planning. They had no idea that, behind my pleasant smile and my easy agreement, I was already putting things in motion. I was going to make Jason pay for what he did. He just didn't know it yet. I had spent my entire life being told that family comes first, that forgiveness is a virtue, that holding grudges only leads to bitterness. But as I sat in my car outside the insurance office, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, I realized that those rules had only ever applied to me. Jason had never been expected to forgive or compromise or sacrifice, because Jason had never faced real consequences, not once, not ever, not in all the years he had coasted through life on a wave of other people cleaning up his messes. But that was about to change, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to be the one left picking up the pieces. When I walked into the insurance office, the air conditioning blasted against my skin, a stark contrast to the fire simmering in my chest. The calculated rage that had been fueling me since the moment Jason had sneered in my face and told me our parents would make me forgive him. The woman at the desk barely looked up as she typed something into her computer, her voice clipped and professional as she asked how she could help. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before speaking, knowing that once I set this in motion, there would be no going back. I need to file a claim for my car, I said, keeping my tone even, my expression carefully neutral. She nodded, clicking a few more times before glancing up at me. Was it an accident? Do you have a police report? Yes, there's a report, I said, my pulse steady, my decision unwavering. And I need to report it as unauthorized use. That made her pause. She blinked once, tilting her head slightly, as if trying to determine whether she had misheard me. Unauthorized use, she repeated, her voice laced with a note of curiosity. Are you saying your vehicle was stolen? I could have said yes, but I knew better than to lie outright, especially when the truth was just as damning. I never gave permission for him to take it, I clarified, choosing my words carefully, making sure there was no room for misinterpretation. I explicitly told him he couldn't drive my car, and he took it anyway. That's theft, isn't it? The woman hesitated for only a second before nodding slowly, typing something into her system, her gaze flicking toward the screen as she read through what I assumed were company policies on situations like this. If you can provide proof that you denied him permission and he took the vehicle regardless, then yes, this qualifies as unauthorized use. I reached into my purse, pulling out my phone, my fingers moving swiftly as I pulled up the text messages from Jason, the ones where I had told him no, the ones where he had laughed it off like my words meant nothing. I turned the screen toward her, watching as she read over the messages, her eyebrows raising slightly before she nodded again. "This should be sufficient," she said, her voice now purely professional, her fingers moving over the keyboard with precision. "Since you're filing for unauthorized use, the liability will not fall on you. It will transfer to the driver." Jason. The liability would transfer to Jason. The reality of it sank in slowly, like warm honey drizzling over the cold steel of my fury, coating it in something rich and satisfying. Jason, who had spent his entire life escaping responsibility, would finally have to answer for something. Jason, who had laughed in my face and told me I would have to forgive him, was about to learn what it felt like when the world didn't bend to his will. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, though inside, my heart was thudding with a strange, unfamiliar thrill. The woman glanced at her screen, adjusting her glasses before answering. "Well, given the extent of the damage, the estimated total he'll be responsible for is somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000. $30,000 to $40,000. I exhaled slowly, absorbing the number, letting it roll over me like a wave of pure vindication. Jason had never had to deal with anything more than a slap on the wrist, never had to truly face the weight of his actions, but now, that weight was about to come crashing down on him, and I wasn't going to lift a single finger to stop it. By the time I walked out of the office, the sun was shining brighter, the air felt crisper, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt good. I felt powerful. I felt free. Later that night, I sat in my apartment, scrolling through social media, my eyes narrowing as I landed on Jason's latest post, a picture of him and his friends at a bar, drinks in hand, his caption as arrogant as ever. "Tough day, but nothing a few drinks can't fix. Some people need to chill out and move on. Life's too short to stress about little things." Little things. That was what he called it. The sheer audacity of it sent a ripple of laughter through me, a sound so foreign that it startled me for a moment before I leaned back against the couch, shaking my head in amusement. Jason thought he had won. He thought this was over. He thought our parents had bailed him out once again, that everything was going to go back to normal, that I had simply swallowed my anger and moved on like I always had before. But what Jason didn't know, what he wouldn't know until that insurance claim finished processing, was that this time, I wasn't letting it go. This time, Jason was going to learn the hard way. And by the time he realized what I had done, it would already be too late. Sitting at the dinner table, I could already feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on me, thick and suffocating, as if they had collectively decided that tonight would be the night I finally fell back in line. My mother had set the table like it was a holiday gathering, candles flickering in their holders, the smell of roasted chicken and buttery mashed potatoes filling the air, her way of making it clear that this was meant to be a family moment. A night of reconciliation, a scene carefully crafted to smooth over what they viewed as an unnecessary conflict. My father sat at the head of the table, his usual presence commanding but relaxed, his expression giving nothing away, but I knew exactly why we were here, why this meal had been planned so soon after the accident. Why Jason sat across from me with that insufferable smirk stretched across his face, his phone resting next to his plate as if he couldn't be bothered to pretend this mattered to him at all. I could feel it coming, the inevitable conversation they had all rehearsed in their heads, the carefully chosen words they would use to convince me that my anger was an inconvenience rather than justified, that my reaction was exaggerated rather than appropriate, that Jason deserved my forgiveness simply because he was family. But as I sat there, my hands resting in my lap, a thick envelope pressed between my fingers beneath the table, I felt nothing but an eerie sense of calm, because unlike them, I already knew how this dinner was going to end. Jason was the first to speak, his voice dripping with the kind of arrogance that had been nurtured since childhood, his words laced with condescension, his smirk widening as he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. "So, have you finally calmed down, or are you still planning to throw a tantrum over a stupid car?" The words barely registered, barely stirred anything inside me, because I had already expected them, already prepared for the way he would turn this into a joke, already knew that he would try to make me look like the unreasonable one in front of our parents. I simply tilted my head, offering him a small, unreadable smile, watching as his confidence grew in the face of what he assumed was submission, watching as my parents exchanged relieved glances, believing foolishly that they had won. My mother let out a dramatic sigh, the kind that was meant to sound exasperated but gentle, as if she were taking on the exhausting role of mediator, as if she were the only one with the patience to deal with me. Emily, sweetheart, I know this has been a stressful situation for you, but we really need to put this behind us as a family. Jason made a mistake, but you holding on to this anger isn't going to fix anything. My father, ever the voice of reason, ever the man who prided himself on being level-headed and pragmatic, nodded along as he cut into his chicken, speaking without even looking up from his plate. Life is too short to get caught up in things like this, Emily. At the end of the day, it's just a car. Things can be replaced. Family can't. I could feel the satisfaction radiating off Jason, could practically see the way he was relishing in my supposed defeat, his ego inflating with every passing second, his smirk growing more insufferable by the minute. He picked up his fork, twirling it between his fingers, shaking his head with mock disappointment. Seriously, you need to chill. I swear, you've always been like this, overreacting, making everything a huge deal. I mean, come on, I crashed a car, not your entire life. You'll get over it. It was in that moment, as he let out an amused chuckle, as my mother reached across the table to place a reassuring hand over mine, as my father gave a small nod of approval at Jason's words, that I finally moved. I reached beneath the table, pulled the envelope into view, and placed it directly in front of Jason with deliberate precision, the sound of thick paper hitting the polished wood loud enough to make all three of them pause. Jason barely spared it a glance, his smirk still firmly in place as he shook his head, rolling his eyes like I was being dramatic, like whatever I was about to do couldn't possibly be worth his time. What's this? Some angry letter about how I hurt your feelings. Read it, I said simply, my voice even, my expression unreadable. Something in my tone must have caught his attention, because for the first time that night, his amusement wavered, his smirk faltering just slightly as he reached for the envelope, fingers hesitating for only a second before tearing it open. The moment he pulled out the papers, the moment his eyes scanned the words printed across the top, the color drained from his face so quickly that it was almost satisfying to watch, almost poetic in its irony. I watched in silence as his hands tightened around the pages, as his mouth opened and closed without sound, as his entire posture shifted from smug arrogance to quiet, dawning horror. My mother frowned, glancing between us with confusion, her hand still resting over mine, her grip tightening slightly. Emily, what is this? Jason's voice was barely a whisper, his fingers gripping the document so tightly that the edges crumpled under the pressure. What did you do? I took a sip of my wine, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable, just long enough for the weight of reality to settle onto Jason's shoulders before I finally spoke, my voice calm, measured, almost gentle. That, dear brother, is the finalized insurance report. The one that officially transfers full liability to you. The air shifted instantly, thick with tension, suffocating in its weight, the sudden realization hitting my parents like a slap across the face. My father finally looked up from his plate, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth, his eyes sharp, calculating, trying to piece together what had just happened, trying to understand how Jason had gone from untouchable to responsible. My mother pulled her hand away from mine, flipping through the papers with growing panic, her breath hitching as she processed what this meant, as she read the numbers printed clearly in bold ink. Jason, for the first time in his life, looked afraid. And I had never felt more satisfied in my entire existence. Jason's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he pushed back from the table with enough force to rattle the silverware, his breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts, his face twisted in a mixture of disbelief and fury, his hands gripping the insurance papers so tightly that they crumpled under his fingers. He stood there for a moment, his chest rising and falling as he stared at me with something that looked almost like betrayal, as if I had somehow wronged him by refusing to roll over and accept what he had done, as if the real crime here was not his recklessness, not his entitlement, not his theft, but my audacity in making him face the consequences of his actions. His voice was tight when he finally spoke, low and furious, shaking with barely contained rage. "This isn't funny, Emily. Tell me you're joking." I didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch between us, watching as panic flickered across his face, watching as he looked from me to our parents like he was expecting them to step in and fix this before it spiraled out of control. My mother's lips were slightly parted, her fingers clutching at the fabric of her blouse, her eyes darting across the papers in front of her as if searching for a loophole, a way out, some piece of information that would make this all go away. My father, ever the composed one, took a deep breath and placed his hands flat against the table, his voice measured, calm, but laced with something dangerously close to frustration. "Emily," he said, his gaze sharp, heavy with expectation, the way it always was when he wanted me to fold. "This is going too far. You're punishing your brother in a way that isn't just cruel, it's vindictive." Jason let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow, forced, his fingers running through his hair as he turned away from the table, pacing like a caged animal, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is insane. You're actually trying to ruin my life over a goddamn car." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest, my expression unreadable, my voice steady. "No, Jason. I'm not ruining your life. I'm just not cleaning up your mess this time." My mother inhaled sharply, her hand flying to her chest like I had physically struck her, her eyes wide with disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend that I was refusing to play the role she had assigned me since childhood, the role of the responsible one, the one who forgave, the one who smoothed things over, the one who made the sacrifices so that Jason never had to. "Sweetheart, this is going to follow him for years," she whispered, her voice trembling, her fingers tightening around the papers as if she could somehow will them out of existence. "Insurance claims like this, the financial burden, this isn't just some small punishment. This is going to ruin his credit, his future, his ability to do what, Mom?" I interrupted, my voice sharper now, my patience wearing dangerously thin, my hands pressing against the edge of the table. "To keep coasting through life without consequences? To keep taking whatever he wants without worrying about how it affects other people? To keep letting you and Dad protect him from reality?" Jason slammed his hands against the back of his chair, his jaw clenched, his entire body wound so tight I thought he might snap in half. "You're seriously acting like I killed someone," he snarled, his eyes burning with rage, his voice shaking with disbelief. "I made a mistake, okay? I took your car, I wrecked it, I was an asshole about it. Fine, I get it, I screwed up. But you," he gestured wildly to the papers in my mother's hands, his expression twisting in frustration. "You went out of your way to make this as bad as possible for me." Something inside me flared at those words, something raw, something furious, something that had been simmering for years, but had never fully surfaced until now. I rose to my feet slowly, deliberately, my gaze locking onto his, my voice low but unshakable, my anger cold and precise. "You didn't care when I lost something I worked for. Why should I care now that you're losing something?" The words hit him harder than I expected, knocking the breath from his lungs, his expression momentarily faltering, a flicker of something almost like regret flashing across his face, but it was gone just as quickly, buried beneath layers of entitlement, of anger, of the unwavering belief that I was the one being unfair. My father exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temples like this was some exhausting inconvenience, like my refusal to cave was nothing more than an irritation. "Emily, I understand that you're upset, but this isn't right. We're family. We don't do this to each other." I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head, my arms crossing over my chest. "We don't do this to each other? That's funny, Dad, because Jason had no problem doing it to me. And you had no problem letting him." Jason scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief, his hands gripping his hair like he was about to tear it out. "I don't have that kind of money," he muttered, his voice cracking just slightly, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. "How the hell am I supposed to pay for this? For the first time that night, I actually smiled, but there was nothing warm about it, nothing soft, nothing forgiving. "Figure it out," I said simply, turning my back on him, walking toward the door, refusing to look back, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing even a sliver of doubt in my expression. I heard my mother call after me, her voice high with desperation, pleading with me to think this through, to be reasonable, to not let this tear the family apart. But I didn't stop, didn't turn, didn't hesitate. Jason had taken something from me, and for the first time in his life, he was going to give something back, whether he liked it or not. Days passed, but Jason didn't call, didn't text, didn't try to reach out, and honestly, I wasn't surprised in the slightest, because I knew exactly what he was doing. He was scrambling, panicking, trying to find a way out of the mess he had created, desperately hoping that someone, somewhere, would bail him out the way they always had before. I could picture him pacing in his overpriced apartment, running his hands through his hair, calling our parents every hour to demand that they fix this, just like they had fixed everything else for him in the past, never once stopping to consider that maybe, just maybe, this was a problem too big for them to sweep under the rug. I knew my parents had money, but I also knew that they weren't rich enough to make $40,000 magically disappear, not without making serious sacrifices, not without dipping into funds that were meant for their own security, not without shaking the foundation of their comfortable lives in a way that would make them deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. And if there was one thing I knew for certain, it was that my parents despised being uncomfortable. The first time Jason finally showed up at my apartment, I didn't even have to check the peephole to know it was him, the aggressive pounding on my door, the impatient huff of breath on the other side. The sheer entitlement practically radiating through the wood was all the confirmation I needed. I took my time answering, letting him stew, letting the silence stretch long enough to make him wonder if I was even going to acknowledge him at all, letting him feel just a fraction of the frustration and helplessness that I had felt when he had stolen my car and wrecked it without a second thought. When I finally opened the door, I found him standing there looking disheveled, the dark circles under his eyes more pronounced than usual, his normally cocky posture slightly hunched, his fingers twitching at his sides like he was barely holding himself together. I leaned against the door frame, arms crossed over my chest, my expression carefully neutral as I arched an eyebrow at him. "Something wrong, Jason?" His jaw clenched at my words, his eyes flashing with something dark, something dangerous, something that looked an awful lot like a last-ditch attempt at control. "You need to undo this," he said, his voice low, tight, barely restrained. "I don't care what it takes, I don't care what you want from me, just make this go away." I let out a quiet breath through my nose, shaking my head slightly, my expression unchanging, my patience non-existent. "It's done," I said simply, my voice steady, calm, unshakable. "You'd need a lawyer and about 30 grand to fight it, and we both know you don't have either of those things." For a split second, I saw something in his face crack, a tiny fracture in the carefully constructed mask of confidence he had worn for his entire life, a flicker of pure, unfiltered panic that he couldn't quite suppress. But just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, replaced by anger, by resentment, by the same defensive arrogance he always defaulted to when things didn't go his way. He let out a sharp, bitter laugh, running both hands through his hair before dropping them to his sides, his shoulders tensed, his breathing uneven. "You seriously hate me this much?" he demanded, his voice rising now, his composure slipping with every passing second. "You seriously think I deserve to have my entire life destroyed over a fucking car?" I tilted my head slightly, watching him with something close to amusement, something cold and detached and utterly devoid of sympathy. "You destroyed my car without a second thought, Jason. Why should I care that I'm destroying your bank account?" His hands curled into fists at his sides, his nostrils flaring, his entire body shaking with barely contained rage, his voice breaking under the weight of his own desperation. "This isn't fair, Emily. You're punishing me for something that was never meant to be this serious, something that wasn't supposed to ruin me. I made a mistake, okay? A stupid mistake. But what you're doing, it's cruel, it's calculated, it's insane." I felt my lips twitch. Not quite a smile, not quite anything at all, just a small, satisfied acknowledgement of the irony of the moment, of the way Jason was finally experiencing something he had never once considered before: accountability. "You'll figure it out," I said simply, shifting my weight onto one foot, my voice light, almost dismissive. "That's what you always do, right?" For the first time in his life, Jason had nothing to say. I started to close the door, but before I could, his phone buzzed in his pocket, and I saw his face shift into something that almost resembled fear, his fingers fumbling to pull it out, his eyes scanning the screen with a mixture of confusion and dread. I leaned casually against the doorframe, watching as his expression darkened, his jaw tightening, his fingers gripping the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "What's wrong, Jason?" I asked, my voice dripping with false innocence, my eyes never leaving his face. His mouth opened slightly, like he wanted to say something, but no words came out, just a sharp, uneven breath, just the sound of his own world crumbling around him. And I knew, in that exact moment, that he had finally gotten the message I had been waiting for him to receive, the one from his employer, the one informing him that his reckless behavior had raised concerns, the one explaining that his recent promotion was now being reevaluated, the one making it clear that his golden boy immunity was officially over. For the first time in his life, Jason was well and truly alone. I didn't wait for him to look up at me, didn't wait to see the full scope of his realization, didn't wait to hear whatever pathetic excuse or desperate plea was bound to spill from his lips. I simply smiled, a slow, knowing, satisfied smile, and gently shut the door in his face.